Hi students, this is Professor Joseph Holbrook getting ready to give you an overview of Chapter 3. I may have to do this one in two parts because it's a lot of content in Chapter 3. We're going to try to cover 2,000 years of history in just about 20 or 30 minutes or less. So that's quite a challenge. This chapter, or Chapter 3 of Hunt and Collender, is called The Emergence of Western Europe. And so we're going to begin with the emergence of Western Europe. Um, we're beginning with the historical period, as opposed to discussing the Paleolithic Age or the early Neolithic Age. The Neolithic Age was when Stone Age cultures began to practice agriculture, which was a revolution in human civilization. The agricultural revolution began around 6 or 7,000 BC, and because of the ability to grow surplus crops, this allowed specialization, and some people were able to devote themselves to areas of work and concern other than agriculture, such so that you begin to have rulers, priests of the ancient religions, artisans, warriors, other people who specialize as opposed to focusing on raising of crops. And this was due to the food surplus. This also led to the development of urban centers and early civilization. The two primary areas where early civilizations began, which concern us in Europe or Western civilization, were Mesopotamia, which is modern-day Iraq and Syria, and Egypt. Also around 3000 BC, which is before Christ, there was a development of writing technologies, which allowed history to be recorded. It allowed human knowledge to accumulate even more greatly because it no longer depended only on memory but in writing technologies, written records, and it also allowed the recording of human history. Cities also were developed and improved cultivation and sanitation. So here is a picture of Mesopotamia. You can see Baghdad, which has been in the news over the last few years. This was the cradle of civilization. Also down in this area you see Cairo. That is Egypt. And here's a picture of ancient Egypt. Near the Mediterranean Sea was called Upper Egypt, and Lower Egypt. Lower Egypt was where the Nile River emptied out into the Mediterranean Sea. Upper Egypt was at a higher elevation and was the headwaters of the Nile River. So in the development of cities in early civilization, one model of city or urban development was the Greek city-states, which developed something called polis order, which you could also translate as politics. Political institutions, words like police, political, politics, they all come from, polity is another word, all come from this Greek word polis, which is the idea of citizenship and the practice of politics, of political order. It allowed protection and leadership in exchange for goods in small villages. Disputes and surpluses led to the establishment of kingdoms, which were a coalition of villages on a larger scale. As kingdoms increased in size, so does power and the divinity of leaders. So you have the figure of a god king emerge, or a divine king. Here is a graphic illustration of the social structure of Mesopotamian urban centers or cities. You had the divine ruler at the top, the strong leader, who ruled over a kingdom and a coalition of many villages. Below him you had the military aristocracy. Then below them was the priesthood, and then you had peasants who were primarily involved in agriculture, and below them you had slavery. Stable civilizations emerged in Mesopotamia, One of the things that Mesopotamia is known for is the Code of Hammurabi, which was the first recorded legal code in history, predating the Ten Commandments of Moses. You had stable civilizations also emerging in Egypt and Greece, and you had the roots of modern Western civilization, especially coming from Greece. This polis, the idea of a political community, is particularly important. Because the idea of the political community, which is exemplified in Sparta and Athens, included a constitution, sometimes written, sometimes unwritten, but a constitutional basis for the political community of the city-state, and you had separation of powers, checks and balances, just as we do today in our modern political community in our U.S. Republic. This was unheard of in more Oriental civilizations, such as the Persian Empire, which was very despotic. It was more like the triangle we saw earlier with the divine king at the top, and no concept of citizenship. Macedonia was a province on the northern edge of Greece, from which came Philip of Macedon, and then later his son Alexander the Great, who made a huge influence on history. This is a picture of the Greek city-states around the Aegean Sea. You had Greek city-states on the landmass of Greece, as well as on the landmass of Asia Minor, which is modern Turkey, as well as in many of the islands. And these Greek city-states developed the idea of individual freedom, democracy, and many of the values we have today. Freedom of the press. Alexander the Great was a military genius. In his early 30s, he inherited his father's throne, and he had the ambition to invade and defeat the Persian Empire. So around 334 BC, or before Christ, he crossed over from Greece to Asia Minor, which is modern Turkey, with 48,000 soldiers, 6,100 cavalry, and 120 ships. And he fought his way through Asia Minor, which was controlled by Persia, and then moved down through modern Syria and Iraq, defeating the Persian Empire, down through what is today is Israel or Palestine, into Egypt, where he conquered the Egyptian Empire, back up and across Iran or Persia, into Afghanistan, and through the Bactrian Mountains, into the western part of India. And tradition has it that he got to a critical point in India and was going to cross a river to conquer the mainland of India, and his troops rebelled and refused to follow him any further. And he wept because he was unable to continue his conquests. And so he was forced to return to Persia, where he got food poisoning and died at the age of 33. But his conquest led to the creation of Hellenistic civilization. Hellen referring to Greek. And so in this entire area that he conquered began to be influenced by the Greek language, Greek literature, Greek philosophy, and Greek science. And many Greek people moved into these areas and formed Greek-speaking colonies. This prepared the way for the future Roman Empire by providing a world civilization, a cosmopolitan civilization, somewhat similar to what we have today with English, being a kind of a cosmopolitan worldwide global language. So this takes us to the Roman influence on modern Western civilization. The Romans were highly influenced by the Greeks and built on their foundation. Although the Roman people had a different set of cultural values than the Greeks did. They adopted the Greeks' pantheon of gods and goddesses, although they gave them Latin names, and they took much of the culture and science and philosophy from the Greeks and perfected it. But the Romans are much more oriented around government, law, engineering, much more practical and less theoretical and artistic than the Greeks. So some of the Roman values that continue to influence Western civilization would include some personal values, which are the dominance of family. If you come from a Hispanic culture, Hispanic family, you know how important family is, and that's very much a Roman cultural value. The Romans allowed more authority for women in household matters, unlike the Greeks, in which women were property, basically. Roman women had property rights. There was networking, ingenuity in solving technical problems, and a calendar system was invented by the Romans. In terms of Roman government, it was efficient, flexible, humane. It was what might be called, in a 20th century phrase, military-industrial complex. There was political patronage, which meant the people at the top doled out favors to their followers in order to ensure their loyalty. They relied heavily on engineering with their roadways and waterworks. They had a concept of empire, and they also had an urban civilization and a flexible legal system that continues to influence Western civilization down through today. I might add that what's not on the list here is that the Roman Republic and later the Roman Empire also borrowed from the Greeks the idea of separation of powers, constitutional government, and checks and balances, which we also have today in modern democratic systems. So here's a picture of the Roman Empire in about 400 AD after Christ. You see that it extended up to Great Britain, almost up to Scotland, and also all the way down to Egypt. Some of the far eastern portions of Alexander the Great's empire broke away and reverted to the Persian Empire, to Afghanistan and India, and were not part of the Roman system. However, the Roman Republic eventually completely surrounded the Mediterranean, with North Africa, Spain, France, Italy, the Balkans, Greece, Asia Minor, and Palestine. So that brings us up to the Romans. And continuing on, the Roman Empire was divided into two halves by Constantine, the first Christian emperor, and Constantine moved his capital to a small town called Byzantium, which he renamed Constantinople, which today is known as Istanbul and is the capital of Turkey. And so you had the eastern half of the Roman Empire and the western half. The eastern half eventually became what was known as the Byzantine Empire, and it lasted for another 1,000 years until they were defeated by the Turks in the 15th century. The western half of the Roman Empire gradually declined and began to collapse inward or implode upon itself in the 5th century after Christ. And as it began to contract and begin to not have new lands for its soldiers, was unable to pay its soldiers, the price of food went up as they were unable to capture people in war to enslave as agricultural workers, and a number of things happened that caused the Roman Empire to begin to contract. And during this time, wandering tribes, primarily Germanic tribes, penetrated the Roman Empire, particularly in 476 AD, and began to invade cities as Rome itself, and to pillage and sack cities, and to wreak havoc in the Roman Empire. Also, about a century and a half later, you have the rise of Islam, and Muslims began to spread into former Roman areas such as Egypt, Palestine, up into Persia, into North Africa, and across the Mediterranean into Spain and Portugal, and nearly threatened France and Central Europe itself. So the Roman Empire was collapsing, and Europe